Good morning, folks. This is Instructor Gaynor here. This is just a little impromptu conversation about the moral problems part of the course. Sorry I'm out of uniform today. Anyway, I just wanted to talk about this part of your ethics course. This is the part pertaining to the analysis of contemporary moral problems. I just wanted to discuss, I should say, explain the overview and aim of this part of the course. You have already been exposed to some of the principles of ethics. Earlier on in the course, we talked about some starting points for ethical thinking. We talked a little bit about logical analysis, which will come in handy in this part of the course. We also discussed value theory. Recall, that's the area of ethics that is concerned with questions such as, what are the components of a good life? Are there elements of human happiness that are objective, or are all of those subjective? We also discussed an array of normative theories. Recall that normative theories try to give us an account of what is right and wrong, and in some cases they also give us some kind of decision procedure for figuring out what the best thing to do is, ethically speaking, given particular scenarios. Now, this is going to be our chance to apply particularly those normative theories, or at least see how others have applied those normative theories to try to solve some contemporary moral dilemmas. Now, I want to talk about analyzing arguments for a moment. You will be reading some contemporary arguments in favor or against particular positions. Some of the ones that we're going to be looking at are if we have duties to helping those who are less fortunate than us. We'll be looking at euthanasia. We'll be looking at abortion. We'll be looking at if animals ought to be considered to have moral standing. We'll be looking at gun rights, for example, as well as affirmative action, just to name a few. Now, the hope is when you're reading these essays that you will try to keep in mind what is or are the positions that this author is taking. Or to put it another way that you might be able to grasp, can you identify what the author's thesis is? This is the conclusion that the author hopes that you will draw after you have read the author's essay. Now, in order to effectively argue for the thesis, the arguer is going to have to give, hopefully, at least one supporting reason or supporting reasons for why someone else ought to take that position. Now, keep in mind, there will be implicit value judgments made by all of these authors. And those value judgments will typically amount to what kind of normative framing is the author essentially applying. Now, to give you one example, and I hope this isn't cheating ahead, but one of the issues that you will be discussing will be the abortion topic. It's a heated topic, plenty of disagreement in contemporary society about it. Now, to give an example, many of the people who argue against abortion in all or at least in most circumstances are going to tend to argue from one of the following positions. You're likely to hear natural law arguments that are against abortion. Well, why? Recall from our conversation that natural law held the viewpoint that certain kinds of beings do have intrinsic worth. In particular, beings such as ourselves that have the capacity to have higher qualities of life. Now, recall that according to natural law ethics, things of value ought to be allowed to thrive, that is, to meet their potential. Now, the idea here is that if one aborts the fetus, one is cutting off that life that has inherent worth, that has potential, that is of value in and of itself. Now, you're also likely to hear folks arguing, Kantians are also likely to argue, in most cases, not all necessarily, against abortion. Essentially on similar grounds to the natural law perspective. Now remember, we talked about the idea that certain kind of lives have dignity. Now what kind of lives? Well, rational beings possess dignity according to Kant. Even though a fetus does not yet possess rationality, the idea is the fetus will be a life that will possess this kind of dignity. So a Kantian in general would not be pro-euthanasia. Now let me just give you one more example. Religious arguments. Now the author of the text is clear about this. Sacred texts do not mention abortion directly. All religious accounts that are anti-abortion typically involve a fair amount of interpretation of sacred texts to get to that point. So yeah, you're likely to get people from religious perspectives arguing against abortion. Now, let me add something else in here. Notice that in contemporary America, we are likely to hear a lot of these contemporary problems framed around rights. If you don't know this already, you'll probably notice this in the readings. It shouldn't surprise you that a lot of contemporary moral problems in the US are framed around rights. This is because we are, in general, a society that is based around a secular social contract. And in our version of the social contract, individuals have rights. And our first right, if you will, folks, is our right to our body. Now, this phrase is never used directly in the text, but I'd like you to know it. And I mentioned it before when discussing social contract theory. We are said to have a right to bodily self-determination because our first piece of property, if you will, is our body. And the argument is that nobody has a right to dispose of my body except for me. We are a society centered around rights. We value rights. So it shouldn't surprise you very much that those who argue against abortion sometimes frame the issue in terms of the fetus's right to life. Now, of course, there's more to it, because even if we did articulate that there was in general a right to life, that would lead to a conversation about what the right to life would entail. Does it just mean a right to be born, or does it mean a right to sustenance? Now, keep in mind, those are things that we disagree about in our contemporary social contract. Now, those who tend to be for abortion rights, that is, to claim that a woman ought to have a right to an abortion, is also likely to argue on the grounds of rights. Now, the idea is that the woman has a right to her person in her body, and that no one else or no intrusive state has any right to tell her what she can and cannot do with her body. Now, indeed, proponents and opponents of abortion rights ought to understand that even if you argue that the fetus does have a right to life, there is certainly a conflict between the woman's right to bodily self-determination and the fetus's right to life. So even granting these assumptions, things still aren't very easy. I just wanted to give that as a little overview. Now, to continue, one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about the abortion issue a little bit here is because I wanted to talk about one of the next things that you ought to keep in mind while you're reading these essays. And I've talked about this before in other lectures. A fundamental piece in a philosopher's argumentative kit bag are these things that we sometimes call thought experiments. The beauty of a thought experiment is that in order to think about an issue differently or in a new and novel way, we need not have to carry out this experiment in reality. It is one that is designed for us to be able to think through it and potentially to look at an issue differently, or in some cases, the thought experiment might be designed to actually take ourselves out of our emotional commitments so that we can perhaps see the situation a little bit differently than we did before. Now, if I was not clear in the importance of thought experiments, it's probably fair for me to talk about a specific example. Now, one of the most well-known and heavily anthologized arguments in favor of abortion rights is one by Judith Jarvis Thompson. It's in this book. It's also anthologized in many textbooks. It's one of the longer readings, and one of the reasons why it's an effective one to talk about is because she uses a series of thought experiments in order to articulate her position. And I want to talk briefly about her most well-known and provocative thought experiments. It is her case of the virtuoso violinist. Now, she asks the reader to imagine that you wake up, you don't know where you are. You're strapped down to a gurney. You find all these tubes attached to you. Now, you look over and you see there's some person on a gurney next to you that's hooked up to those tubes. You have no idea how you got there. You know you didn't get there by choice, and you don't know this person on the gurney next to you from Adam. Now, some people walk into the room and they explain to you that they are from the Society of Great Music Lovers, and that this person next to you who you're attached to is a famous virtuoso violinist who matters a lot to a whole lot of people. That is the Society of Great Music Lovers. You're informed that your body is exactly right for helping to keep this fellow alive, and that after 9 months, he'll be perfectly fine, but that we just need to keep you hooked up to him for 9 months. Now, the question is, does this virtuoso violinist have any right to your body? Judith Jarvis Thompson answers no. Now, if you wanted to be nice, you might consent to this. Also, it is these other people who have forced you to do this against your will. Now, who are these people? You don't know them from Adam either. You also don't owe them anything. However, knowing that some people care very much about this virtuoso violinist, you might decide to stay hooked up for 9 months to save his life. But she argues that you have no obligation to do so. Because in our model of the social contract, admittedly, I'm spelling this out a little bit more than is done in the essay for effect. In our version of the social contract, you have rights. To be forced to do something against your will, to have your right to bodily self-determination taken away from you, is a societal failure. Now, what's the point of all this? Now, this is indeed a thought experiment that is supposed to set up, it's supposed to set up an analogy. It is supposed to be analogous to the case where a woman becomes pregnant due to rape. Taken against her will, forcibly hooked up. Now, many people will claim that it's not the fetus's fault, and the fetus should not be punished for this. And that the woman should be forced to go through with the pregnancy, because the fetus's right to life overrides her right to bodily self-determination. Now, J.J. Thompson tries to use this thought experiment to take us out of our normal way of thinking, hopefully to look at it a little bit more abstractly, because people get emotional when they talk about babies. The idea is, here we have a situation that's analogous, but it's different enough to try to get people to look at the situation a little bit differently. Her hope is to persuade people that if they're thinking rationally about this, no one would say that you don't have a right to unplug yourself. Because if you believe in something like the right to bodily self-determination, and if you also believe that nobody can force you to do anything against your will, particularly in a case where you've been directly violated, that she can persuade her readers that even if you are generally not pro-abortion, that abortion at least ought to be allowable in conditions like this. Now, this is not the only thought experiment she uses. And keep in mind, some of the other tools used by philosophers will be specific examples that are not thought experiments. They're actual examples. And in other cases, sometimes we will use certain counterexamples to try to get our readers to look at things another way. Now, I hope I've done some justice by giving a specific example here. And I hope you have an enjoyable time reading some of these essays, finding out what the authors are arguing, what kinds of supporting reasons that the author's giving, and then hopefully you'll also try your hand at critical analysis. And in the end, even if your minds aren't changed about anything, that's not necessarily going to happen. The hope is that you will have looked at things philosophically. That is, tried to analyze arguments. Tried to see to it that if you're going to hold a particular position, it will have supporting reasons, and that you will at least have heard some of your critics and at least have thought meaningfully about how to answer some of those criticisms. Cheers.